We are creatures of desire. What we most desire is meaning. What makes us suffer most is a lack of meaning.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Marital therapist, author, and communications trainer Andrew G. Marshall invites guests from all walks of life to discuss what makes life meaningful.
Hello, I'm Andrew G. Marshall. Welcome to The Meaningful Life. We're available on Apple, Spotify, Podbean, and wherever you find your podcasts. How do you care for others without burning out yourself? In the safety announcements on airplanes, they always tell you to put on your own oxygen mask first before you help other people. We know it's good advice and we want to follow it. But when it comes to people we love, especially if they have great needs, we can focus on them to the extent that we forget ourselves. My guest today knows all about caring and being a carer. Penny Winceer is the author of Tender, The Imperfect Art of Caring. As a child, she cared for a mother who suffered from depression and often couldn't function properly. And today, she's the mother of an autistic son with complex needs. Penny is also the host of Not Too Busy to Write, which I would also recommend. I've just recently discovered it and already enjoying it. So, Penny, tell me about your experience as a child. When did you start to feel responsible for your mother?
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, first of all. I started supporting my mother. I suppose it happened gradually at first. So it took me a long time to realize. In fact, I really didn't understand that I had done it until I was an adult. But my mother was very well when I was young. In fact, I would say she really thrived with young children. I have two older brothers, and she was really in her kind of thriving era, I think, when we were small. And she started to become unwell, which began with panic attacks when I was around 10 or 11 years old. And that at first became a bit of a problem because we had moved to a farm. I'm from Australia. We'd moved to a farm. It wasn't Australians might not call it a farm because it wasn't in the middle of nowhere, but it was still a good 5-10 minutes drive from anywhere. And this became a problem because when we moved there, my mother, in fact, started having panic attacks the day we moved house. And they were brought on by the car. She would start having them whenever she got in the car. So as you can imagine, we've just moved to a farm and my mother started becoming very fearful of the car. So it was quite isolating at first. So that's how it began. And gradually what happened over the next few years, I would say by the time I was 13, I was taking on quite a lot more responsibility for myself, for, making sure often that I had dinner. She wasn't checking if any of us were doing our homework. I was making sure I was getting myself to and from school every day, because there would be periods of time, not all the time, but periods of time where she just couldn't get out of bed, perhaps for weeks at a time. And I'm sure there'll be people listening who have had this experience with a parent where they go from what I would call, my mother was a hyper-functioning mother in my early years up until I was around 10 or 11, to not actually being able to function at all. And then over time, I was able to look back and realize that I wasn't just looking after myself. I was also supporting her. And what that looked like when I was around 13, 14 was being a shoulder for her to cry on. I was often sitting by her bed for hours at a time, listening to her worries and her concerns. I started editing what I would say to her. And I was very, very close to my mother. We had a really good relationship, a very solid relationship. But I started noticing that I couldn't share things with her that would upset her. And so I started to have to really edit what I was saying to her and couldn't be honest with her about a lot of things, because if I expressed any difficulties in my own life, she would start to spiral because she would feel so guilty about the situation that we were in, about me having to deal with these things alone. So I learned very much to kind of keep everything to myself and look after myself, both emotionally and physically. And of course, I think one of the challenges is, and again, anyone who has been through this experience I'm sure will recognize this, it isn't all the time. It goes in cycles. And so my mother would become much, much more well again. She would go to hospital for a couple of weeks. She would come out. Her medication would be working quite well. She would have some energy. She would feel like her old self again. And my mother was a beautiful, gorgeous woman, with very close friends and really charming and lovely and very caring. and it would be amazing to have her back again. And then gradually I'd start to lose her again. And so it got to the point where you don't want to have to rely on that person when they come back, rely on that energy. She would commit to things and then not end up doing them. Again, another symptom of depression. I would have long conversations with her and she would completely forget them and wouldn't remember what I said. And it took me a long time, I'd say probably until I was around 30, that I understood that was being a young carer, that what I was doing was being a young carer.
It's interesting we don't actually use the word carer and that we hate to use the word carer. Maybe a little bit later we'll discuss why that might be. But I just wondered if you could give us a story that would sort of really illustrate this relationship, something that happened between the two of you.
So I guess a classic thing would be, I was a teenager. Obviously, being a teenager is not the easiest thing in the world. You're trying to navigate so many things. And my mother would promise to show up for something. She would promise to show up at my school. This is Australia. The spaces are really quite far apart. You're often very reliant on a car. And I would expect her to be there and I'd be all excited that she was going to be there and she wouldn't show up. And this was also the 90s, so we didn't have mobile phones. And I would just be there, left completely on my own. And then I would have to find someone to tell them that my mother hadn't turned up and then find some other way of getting home. And so that meant also telling other people what was happening in our household, which I knew was really upsetting to my mum. But then going back home and then not being able to express any emotions at all about what had happened, because I knew if I did, that it would very likely make her worse and I would be responsible. And so when I say worse, I mean, she attempted suicide a number of times and I felt responsible for that. I felt responsible for her well-being. And even though objectively I knew that wasn't true in my mind, I think it's one thing to kind of, know objectively that it's not your fault, but also to feel as though it's your fault. And when actually she was at her worst, when she was not, I would say, in her right mind, she would directly blame me and others for the state that she was in as well. And even though I knew when she was well again, she would apologize, I would know that she wasn't herself when she said those things. You end up kind of creating almost like a shell around you and a barrier between you and that other person to protect yourself, which I think was probably the hardest because it's about losing someone before you lose them. You have to let go of a lot of the things about that relationship, even while that person is still alive and with you.
I wonder how many people are listening to this conversation and they're all in their mind, they're going click, 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 click. They're recognizing all these things and they've never thought that they were actually in some way a carer for their mother or their father. Mm. And I'm wondering what sort of impact this has on you as an adult going forward. Because on one hand, we've got this incredibly secure first part of childhood, and then halfway through childhood, we have this complete and utter change. We can have total honesty and then total editing. What sort of impact do you think that's had on you as an adult?
It's a really interesting one because I really do honestly believe my childhood was split in two. And I think, thank goodness my parents provided us with such stable, loving early years before all of this happened, because I really think it did make a huge difference in my life. But I'd say a big thing that shows up for me is in hyper-independence. And I think this is really common for young carers. This idea that I really struggle to fully rely on other people because of how much it can hurt when they let you down. And that very much comes from those years because my mother was someone I could 100% rely on when I was younger. And then I had to learn to let that go through some very, very painful years.
And that must be very difficult for forming long-term loving relationships because you sort of, to some extent, need to trust the other person, don't you?
And it's funny because I haven't had a difficulty in forming deep friendships and romantic relationships long-term. It's more how much I allow myself to physically depend on them to a certain extent. So that's what's been, I think, one of the really interesting things about having a disabled child, because it has really forced me to confront that. Because I think in my 20s, I was really convinced I could basically do life without relying on people. I think maybe this is quite common in your 20s anyway. But, my mother died when I was 22, and I was released from that responsibility. And that sounds like a terrible way of putting it, but it really did. I was devastated, but it was also a release from the constant worry of it happening. And my 20s were very independent, extremely. I moved countries multiple times. I met my children's father, but he was also quite an island in himself in many ways. And I thought we could continue on as these sort of floating islands. Having children very much made me confront that quite significantly.
So when was it that you began to suspect that your son might be autistic?
His first year went pretty well. He was born early and there was some issues when he was born, but actually pretty quickly it became clear that he was doing well in terms of in line with his early birth. So the first year went pretty smoothly. It was really in the second year some things started happening. But, he was my first child and I just didn't know. I didn't know what was typical and what was not. But it was really the birth of my daughter, which happened just after he turned 2. And it was so glaringly obvious that his reaction to having a baby in the house was not typical, and that whatever was going on with him was not delays, but something was different about him. And that in terms of how that presented, he couldn't bear his baby sister making any noise whatsoever, and he would attack her, even just making little mewing noises. Obviously, no toddler probably likes hearing piercing cries from a newborn, but even just tiny little
Nobody does.
So he would react very strongly to that, to the point where I had to put her, when I was putting him to bed and he needed a lot of support going to sleep, I would have to leave her across the other side of the flat alone and just leave her there, because he couldn't even bear her being in a sling on my chest when I was putting him to bed. And then when that wasn't happening, he was completely oblivious to her. So if I put her on a playmat on the floor, he could potentially just walk on top of her because he didn't even notice that she was there. So there was this kind of disconnect, not understanding that she was a human. She was sort of an object to him in a way. He couldn't quite get his head around the fact that she was, another person, in the way that I could see he totally could with adults in his life. He would laugh with and giggle with and snuggle with, but he couldn't see her that way. And so I think that for me was the biggest thing, where I was like, oh yeah, it's not just that he's not speaking yet. It's not just that he's, reacts in very extreme ways when he's having a meltdown, like, a toddler tantrum, I called it in those days. But yeah, there was some signs around then, and he was diagnosed around 3, which is just the length of time it took for us to get the referrals. But we knew from, I'd say, around 2 years old.
So was it a relief to have a diagnosis, or was it horrifying to have a diagnosis? Oh,
it was such a relief, because by the time he received it, we were so certain that's what it was, that we were like, great, okay, excellent, what's next? And it was funny, actually, the developmental pediatrician who diagnosed him said, oh yeah, okay, that's not always how parents react. That's interesting. And we were like, look, we've been reading about this for the past year, so we know what we're seeing, and we're glad that you agree, and we're desperate for support and help. What are you going to do for us? Turns out nothing, really. Which is, I think pretty typical here in the UK. I think that was my first big shock, was how you could get a lifelong diagnosis for your child, life-changing lifelong diagnosis, and nothing really happens after that. I think with developmental disabilities, one of the big issues is that they do I think the NHS relies very heavily on education to provide a lot of the support. And, my son was not in school yet, and it took a long time then to get the support in place through education. So we were all excited, actually. We were very excited to get the diagnosis, and then very disappointed that actually it didn't really lead to very much at all.
And would you have described yourself at that point as a carer?
No, I wouldn't have. I think at that point I definitely understood that I had been a young carer, but I couldn't quite make the word fit for what I was doing as a parent. And I think this is quite typical, particularly at first, because at what point does parenting end and caring begin? And I think this is such an interesting question that so many parents come up against. Now I understand very clearly what that line is, which is that caring begins where other parents don't have to go. Caring begins where, you're being like a legal advocate and you're having to do appointments that other families would not have to do. Caring is taking your child to hospital appointments when other parents are going to the local library to do, read along, sing and sign sessions or something. This is the life of parent carers. It can look extremely different to other parents, but you get all of the regular parenting stuff as well, of course, thrown in there.
Because I think the ultimate job of parenting is to prepare your children to leave you, which is something that most parents don't consciously think about. But that's not a task that you're going to be doing. Yes. And I think this is one of the things that was really difficult in those early days. Well, there was two things. One was that I very much understood, even though I didn't necessarily use the word care at first in my mind, I very much understood that I had done this before. I had done it before. I had had responsibility for someone else's life in this way before. But the difference was that because this was now my child and this child was younger than me and hopefully would have a long life, that this will literally never end. Unlike with my mother, it ended. I was released from that responsibility at some point. And it was really, that feeling was incredibly overwhelming at first. And I think it was probably even more overwhelming because I had done it before and I knew what it meant. I knew what it meant in a very kind of real, visceral level to know that what you say and do and how you behave has a direct impact on somebody else's life and that you are ultimately responsible for keeping them alive. And that was incredibly overwhelming. So that would be the first thing. But then the second thing as well was that, and I'm sure anyone listening that has a child with a lifelong disability will know this feeling of everyone around you talking about it getting easier, as the child becomes a little bit more independent, suddenly they can talk, suddenly they can follow instructions. They're going to school, they're going to holiday clubs, they're going off to friends' houses, all that kind of stuff. And they get more and more independent. Generally, obviously, there are little, back and forths. Children like to kind of retreat sometimes. But generally, it is a forward motion towards independence. And actually, a lot of the complaints are how quickly that happens and how obsolete some parents feel and all of the emotions, very real emotions associated with that. And parenting a child with a lifelong developmental disability, it's the opposite. It has only become more challenging. And part of the reason it's more challenging is because the older my son gets, the less accessible the world around us is to him, because an autistic 3 and 4 or 5-year-old can go to activities suitable for other 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds. But an autistic 15-year-old with learning disabilities cannot access activities designed for 15-year-olds. It's just not possible. And he can't go and access the activities for 5-year-olds, which he'd really love to do because it's completely inappropriate because he's 4 times the size of a 5-year-old and not safe to be with. He's not safe to be around 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds. But developmentally, he wants to be at soft play. He wants to be in the sand pit. That's what he would love to do. And so what becomes more challenging as your child grows is that the world is far less accessible to them, which has a huge impact on the people around them that support them. And so we're in an opposite world. We're in this opposite world where instead of our children becoming more independent and our time and energy and headspace becoming a little bit freer, even though, of course, parenting teens is very challenging, no matter whether they're disabled or not. But it is a different kind of challenge to parenting young children. And when you're parenting disabled children who are very dependent on you and require that high level of support that young children require, you find yourself in this opposite world. And when I think there's that extra layer of challenge then when your experience is very different to everybody else's around you, because it can really create these additional feelings of dissonance, that there's something wrong with us and our family and the way we live because our experience doesn't reflect those of the people around us. So why do you think we all reject the idea of being carers and actually taking on, let's call it a label? Do you think that's actually helpful?
I think it's really helpful when we can identify with that label. And I would say the main reason why is It's about acknowledging that what we're doing is beyond what this relationship would usually require of us. And the reason I think that's important, whether that's because you're supporting a child or supporting a partner or a parent, because you're going to face some very, very big difficulties when you're caring for somebody else, when you're supporting them. And if you are convinced, oh, but I'm just being a daughter, I'm just being a partner, I'm just being a parent, then you're denying the additional challenges that you're going through, and you're much less likely to reach out for support if you don't identify those as additional challenges. If you say, but I'm just doing what any parent would do, which I think is a really common refrain to go through a parent's head with a child with a disability or a chronic illness, what you're doing is you're expecting to be able to cope in a way that a parent of a typical child would cope, with the levels of support a typical parent would have. And we absolutely cannot survive that way. What I do parenting a teenager with a developmental disability is so far beyond what a parent of a typical teenager would be doing that if I pretended that that's what I was, I would not be able to take the breaks I need, reach out for support, ask for anything that I need. But on top of that, I would probably feel guilty about asking for that support. But as knowing that my role is as a carer and a parent is where that's where I can let go of some of that guilt of asking for what it is that I need. So I think identifying with the word carer can be incredibly helpful to just really acknowledging, first of all, the situation and then also working towards acceptance.
So I've been thinking about what the issues might be, and I've come up with 3, and I'd like to take you through them. And I think you've already begun to talk about the first one of them, which is isolation. So tell me about isolation.
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we can, if we're surrounded by families, and I don't just mean, those of us with children who are disabled, but also, partners who have, chronic illnesses, mental illnesses, disabilities, and also other family members that we might spend a lot of time with. If our experience looks wildly different to those of us around us, it can be incredibly isolating. We can look inwards and be like, well, why aren't I coping? Why can't I do those things? There must be something wrong with me. So I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing, of course, is that physically it can be very isolating. My son, for instance, can't access most things in our community, and he needs me with him all the time. So I can't just sort of pop out and go do something with my other child, or I can't just sort of bring him with me to situations. And so it can be physically quite isolating. And I do those things because I know if I bring my son along, I will be dealing with consequences much later. And I don't know if I have the energy to deal with consequences by popping out, running some errands with him, with me, will have consequences. And I'm kind of constantly weighing up whether those consequences are worth it. So often I'll say no to things, or there are just things that we just blanket don't do as a family. And that can lead to a physical isolation as well. And so I think that isolation happens on those 2 levels, both the emotional isolation of not feeling like your life reflects anything that you see around you, but then also the physical isolation of having to be quite restricted in where you go and when.
And the next one is going to be terribly obvious after that, and that's loneliness. How do you deal with loneliness? Because it does sound like you're a prisoner sometimes.
I mean, for some people, it can be like that. If you have somebody that you're supporting that cannot function very well out of the house, which I know plenty of families who have that, that have a family member that is really, that their home is their safe place, and going outside of the home needs to be thought about very carefully. So I think that can very easily lead to isolation. I have not experienced this so much, but I have spoken to so many people that have, is that also the isolation and loneliness can come from other friends and family members not understanding, not reaching out, not adapting social situations to suit your family's needs. And I know actually lots of people who have lost, most of their friends through having a family member that is very dependent. That's not an experience I have, although of course there are plenty of friends that I don't get to spend as much time with. And actually for some people, they don't, some people don't understand. Friendships fall by the wayside because people don't understand why you're not available and why you can't just pop around with the kids and you can't do this.
So is your social life online, or do people come to you?
We do all sorts of different things. Well, first of all, I do have some care support in place, which has really helped me over the years. And I've been very fierce about that. And that has been both a privilege because I've, been able to pay for it through the work that I do. But also, I would say it's not just because I've had the money. It's because I've known that it's something that is incredibly important for me to spend the money on. I know plenty of people who do not spend any additional money on carers than absolutely necessary because they feel too guilty to, because they think, well, I can only use paid support if I'm out there earning money. I can't use it to see friends. I can't use it to, I was a single parent for a long time. I can't use it to go on a date. For instance, some people, might say that, but I've been very fierce about protecting my own personal time. And if that means using money that I'm earning to pay for it, then I will do it. And I still do it as much as I possibly can. And that actually comes back to the lessons I learned from my mother, actually. Part of what happened to my mum, it was, very complex what happened to my mother. Lots of different things were coming together that meant she became very unwell. But one of the things was that she did not think of herself until it was too late. She did not look after her own physical and mental well-being until she was absolutely forced to, and it was a crisis. And when it became very clear that my son's needs were going to continue to be very high, I absolutely swore to myself that I would try and protect myself at all costs, because I know what it's like to be the child of a parent who collapses. And I didn't want my children to go through that. The consequences were huge. My mother died when I was 22. I mean, I'm 47 now. So I almost forgot my age for a second. It's been 25 years since my mother died. She's missed everything. She's missed her grandchildren. She's missed everything. And I just, I could not bear to do that to my own children. I just couldn't bear it. And so for me, I think that gave me the strength to ask for the help I needed, pay for the help I needed, where I know actually there'll be so many women listening who have never felt they're allowed.
I can feel the pain that is still there from all those years ago and the hole in your life from losing your mother so young. The third thing that we need to talk about, issues which we haven't really touched on that much, and that is discrimination.
This was such an interesting one. When my son was diagnosed, I really tried to examine I had a lot of fear, as a lot of parents do. And I really wanted to examine where that fear was coming from. And I knew, of course, part of it was the responsibility that I now had, for sure. I knew that was part of it. But I knew it wasn't all of it. Of course, a lot of the fears were around, what is my son's life going to be? And when I really dug into that, I realized one of my biggest fears was actually, not the autism diagnosis at all. Actually, as I mentioned, we were thrilled that he was diagnosed because we could see it. My fears were around how high his needs were going to be and how severe a learning disability he might have. When a child is 3 years old and receives an autism diagnosis, it could literally mean anything. I have so many friends whose children were not speaking at all at 3 years old. And by the time they're 6, they realize that their child is completely fluent in speech and they realize that they're actually kind of a genius. This is not that uncommon. It's not that uncommon a story. At 3 years old, you don't know what the future of your child who's received a diagnosis is going to be. It could be anything. And so I realized a lot of my fears were around how high my son's needs were going to be. And I wanted to understand what that was. And by doing that in a way, I remember thinking, okay, well, if I wasn't doing it all on my own, if we had the right support around us, and, I had the money I needed to provide what I needed for him. And, and my son, of course, I should mention, my son at 3, apart from having a really difficulty with sort of emotional control and having big meltdowns, if he wasn't having a meltdown, he was an incredibly happy child. It was one or the other. He was either laughing his head off and throwing himself around happily and very snugly and incredibly affectionate, or he was sort of quite devastated. There wasn't really much in between. But so based on that, I was thinking, well, if we help him and manage some of the difficulties and things are okay and I'm not doing it all on my own and, all that sort of stuff, what am I really afraid of? What am I really genuinely afraid of? And what I realized was that people with learning disabilities are invisible in our society. They're invisible. They have so little power. They are treated probably the most poorly out of everyone in our society. And I would think of my son and I would think, probably the only worst person off would be someone exactly like him who is a black boy, who is dealing then with race on top of all of these kind of ableist things we're dealing with. And I remember thinking, okay, so actually a lot of my fear is to do with how society is going to treat him. And actually there's nothing wrong with him at all. He is going to have a different kind of life. And that's okay. But a lot of my worries were around what I've been told, what I've seen, how I see disabled people treated in our society, how maligned they are, how little power they hold in our society. And when I understood that and I was able to detangle those fears from the fears, the real kind of fears of, keeping him safe physically, being able to provide for him, all that sort of stuff. It really started to help me understand what I could work on to make his life better and the life of other disabled people better as well.
So how do you not burn out? Because it seems to me that you're a pretty high candidate for just, I can't go on.
Oh, it's an interesting one. I would say I have moments where I don't know how I will keep going. But what I would say is that those are just moments. They're just moments and they come and they go. If we're having a very, very difficult time, a very, very difficult few hours, and we're in that physical kind of crisis where I'm sort of sitting with my son, supporting him through quite a severe meltdown, that I definitely feel like I can't keep doing it. So I think that's really important to say that I think it's actually really normal to have moments where it feels like you aren't going to be able to keep doing it. For whatever reason, I know plenty of people who have supporting a parent through dementia or Alzheimer's, and it can be scary. It can be really scary. And there can be acute moments where you are not sure how you're going to be able to keep doing it. So the first thing I would say is the thing that has helped me the most with those times and recovering from those times is self-compassion. Because I think we can talk about like taking breaks and all those sorts of things. And those things are crucial, absolutely crucial. But when you're in this moment where you're supporting someone, you cannot walk out. You can't look after yourself in that moment. You need to physically be there for them through a very difficult time, whatever that is. Perhaps it's supporting someone who's in immense physical pain, or it could be emotional pain or whatever it is. And you have to just be with them and there's nothing you can do to fix it. There's something that we can do for ourselves in those moments is to offer ourselves compassion and to understand that this is hard for them and it's hard for us, and both things can be true. That has helped me probably the most. And it's funny, I would say that after 15 years, I'm not better in those moments necessarily. Those moments happen and I panic and it's very, very difficult. But I think what's really changed and improved enormously over the years is how quickly I recover from those moments. And I think I'm pretty good at recovery these days in terms of like, we have a really hard time, we get through it, I get to the other side, I do the things I need to do to look after myself to recover from that, and I can move on with my day. One bad hour does not ruin an entire week anymore. It doesn't even ruin necessarily an entire day. It might exhaust me, but it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't ruin me. I don't spend the next 2 days beating myself up because I reacted poorly to what was happening, which of course I still do. I still react poorly. I'm a human and my son can be quite violent during meltdowns and things. And I don't always react in the way that I want to. And I used to really beat myself up about that. And I've learned to get over that quite quickly now. And really, I think self-compassion is at the heart of that.
And I think you have to live in today rather than be thinking about tomorrow, or when I'm saying tomorrow, 5 years' time. Because I think if you start thinking about tomorrow as well, I think that would completely overwhelm.
So overwhelming. And in fact, And it's very hard not to as a parent. It's a very, very hard not to. And it's not that you never will, but you just have to continually remind yourself when you're in these crisis moments to keep just putting that thought aside and try and concentrate on the moment. I remember years ago, probably when my son was around, 8 or something, or 9 maybe, having a bath time that was really kind of noisy and messy and he splashed everywhere. And, it was just, you just have to pay really close attention and it's quite full on, sensory overloads, noisy. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm still doing this and I might be doing this forever in terms of supervising a bath time. And in that moment, I remember feeling like just completely overwhelmed at the fact that, 9 years in, I was still doing it and I would still have to continue doing it. And I just stopped and reminded myself, I just have to do this bath time, just this one. I don't have to do all the bath times I'm ever going to do
one go
right now. I just have to do this one. And I do still have to remind myself because my brain goes there. It's not like I've magically fixed my brain to never think about these things. I wish I had. And I think it's important for me to point out, I think sometimes I worry that because I've written a book about this stuff, that people must think I'm so good at it now. And I'm like, I'm not so good at it. This is it's sometimes just really, really hard. And my brain does go there. When my son's having a really full-on meltdown and things are being broken and I'm worried for both of our physical safety, it's not like I'm not thinking, how am I going to keep doing this? Because I do. But I have to then stop myself and remind myself I don't have to do all of it right now. I just have to do this moment. And that this moment will pass because it does pass. It always does pass.
And I think that's something that we can all take away from this conversation. So thank you for sharing that with us. In a moment, we're going to be looking at a letter and we'll be back after this.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Please follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material and other benefits.
My men's retreat runs from Sunday the 28th of September to Wednesday the 1st of October in the woods just outside Berlin, Germany. Step out of your daily stress. Take stock of where your life is going and deepen your relationship with yourself and other men. One of the reasons everyone feels more anxious is not just the fast-changing world, but how we've become more isolated. In particular, we are cut off from the wisdom and support of other men, mostly because we find it difficult to open up and be truly vulnerable with each other. In my 4-day workshop with a group of like-minded men, we can focus on what it means to be a man today and how we can support our sons to become balanced men. It will be a truly transformative experience, and I would like to share it with you. You can find out more about the beautiful location, the seminar house itself, and the costs on my website, andrewgmarshall.com. Click on the button Men's Retreat. Do it now because we've almost filled half the places.
Thy ticket, Lady Jennifer of Coolidge.
Well, many thanks, good sir. Here'th my Discover card.
They accept Discover at Renaissance fairs?
Yeah, they do here. Discover is accepted at the places I love to shop. Getteth with the times.
With the times? You're playing the lute.
Yeah, and it sounds pretty good, right?
Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report.
Everyone's talking about AI these days, right? It's changing how we work, how we learn, and how we interact with the world at a tremendous pace. But if we're not careful, we might end up in a heap of trouble. This season on Compiler, we're diving deep into how AI is reshaping the world we live in. We're breaking down the requirements, capabilities, and implications of using AI. Join us for the new season of Compiler, an original podcast from Red Hat. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts.
If you'd like to find out more about the program, You can go to my website, andrewgmarshall.com. You'll find all sorts of goodies there. There's articles, there's details about my men's retreat that I've got coming up, and there's often a way to participate in the program and send me a letter. I'm in the process of moving countries, packing up my old life and trying to set up back in my homeland again. I'll need to find a job and somewhere to live after 5 years of being abroad. I'm doing this because I'm burnt out and I just need to go back to my roots, regroup and recharge. It seems a massive task and I'm worried about how to keep going, especially as I can get sick if I'm overloaded. I feel I'm there for other people and give a lot, but it seems I can't rely on friends and family when I need help. I'd appreciate any advice that you can give.
Oh gosh, I really feel for this person because I've moved countries a few times and it is such hard work. It's such hard work. So first of all, I would say, oh my goodness, this is where a good bit of self-compassion can come in. What you're doing is really hard and it feels hard because it is hard. So that's the first thing I would say. And so do go gently and be very kind with yourself and don't expect it to be super easy, I would say. But so it's a tricky one. I would say, again, just like what we were talking about earlier, we don't have to do everything all at one time. When you're doing something big like moving countries, it involves so many moving parts, so many moving parts that I think to help with the overwhelm, it might be better to just focus on the next thing and then the next thing rather than everything all at once, because there are going to be so many different administration things to do as well as physical things to do. And it is overwhelming. I mean, if I think about what it would be like at this point for me to move my life back to Melbourne, where I came from, honestly, it is overwhelming to think about. So I would try and just take it one bit at a time.
I can't see your son on an international flight somehow.
Yes, my son does not fly. No, he doesn't fly at all. Yeah, that is definitely not on the cards for us. Oh, yeah. But even without the complications of having a child, which it sounds like this person perhaps doesn't have children, even without that complication, it's really, really challenging. And even aside from setting up all the logistics of a life in a different country, even if it is your country of origin, it is emotionally huge because you are not the same person you were when you lived there before. You have changed. Your life has changed. And it is sometimes difficult for those two things to meet because then the changes become obvious, which are not necessarily always easy to sit with. But on the front of feeling like you're not getting support from family and friends, that can be really difficult. And I guess I would say to that, I would just make sure that you're being really clear about what you need from them because, and this may not be the case, but it could be the case that perhaps they don't know how to help you and maybe it might seem obvious to you how they might be able to help, but perhaps it's not so obvious to them. So the first thing I would say is perhaps be really clear about how they can help and how much it would help you if they could support you with maybe something quite specific. That would be my first thought. But it's tricky, because I think we can't control what other people do at all. We can only really control what we do. And so I think just communicating really clearly with them might help.
I'm thinking that sometimes people who give a lot, they obviously also expect a lot back. And when they don't get it, they sort of walk away. So there's sort of people are either going to be angels or demons in this world. And most of us are sort of somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
So I think there's something in that. I'm not quite certain what, but something in that needs to be explored.
Yeah. I think I've definitely fallen into this trap occasionally, actually, where actually my best friend at one point called me intimidatingly competent. And when we were talking about something and I was like, what? And she's like, yeah, you can seem so intimidatingly competent from the outside. And that I think sometimes that's led me to expect that other people can do the same as me. And I'm just assuming that because I can do it, that somebody else can. And whether or not perhaps this person has done something similar in terms of the amount that they're able to give, and maybe assuming that these other people can do the same in return, but maybe they're actually not in a place where they can do that, but maybe they can help in some way, in some smaller way.
I hope that's been helpful. So let's start talking about meaning, as you've been a witness on The Meaningful Life. But before we talk about meaning in your own life, I'm sort of fascinated by the idea of, do you think about meaning for your son?
Oh, that's so interesting. This was one of the things that worried me early on with his diagnosis, because I worried actually about him having a sense of purpose, because I think I knew he could be happy. You just only have to spend a bit of time with him and you can see that he can access joy and happiness quite easily, actually. He can also lose it quite easily, but he has access to it. So many things delight him. So I wasn't worried about his happiness, so to speak, feelings of happiness. I was more concerned about, well, where is he going to get a sense of fulfillment and purpose and meaning as a part of that? Because, when you have communication difficulties and you're not a big part of the external world and society. And I was like, where is he going to get those feelings of usefulness from, of meaning and all those sorts of things? It does still concern me sometimes. I don't want him to just be happy. I want for him what my other child is going to have, which is a complex life filled with all kinds of things, all kinds of emotions, including meaning and purpose. And I think I really have come to understand that I think we think something like meaning and purpose need to be very big, huge things, and perhaps they don't need to be big and huge. Perhaps just participating in a community can bring us a huge amount of meaning. Maybe for some people that's like participating in a local choir or a local amateur dramatics. Perhaps for some people that's gardening and growing things and then sharing what they grow, maybe teaching other people how to do it too. I just think actually when I was younger, I used to think that meaning had to be and purpose had to be big and ambitious, and that perhaps they don't have to be. But I do definitely think we all need it. We focus a lot on happiness, but I think purpose and meaning is just as important.
And so what makes your life meaningful?
What's interesting is that I was thinking about this earlier, but I think as a woman, it's an interesting one because, women and girls are raised often to kind of put relationships at the center of meaning in their lives, which I do agree with. Absolutely. I think our relationships are incredibly vital and important for our lives. But I also think for women who have been sort of socialized to often mean that it's the only important thing, should be the only important thing. And it's often done that way so that we provide all the unpaid work in society and be, happy about it, And we're not supposed to get our meaning outside of our immediate families. We're supposed to get meaning from raising children and caring for parents and being in the community and doing all those things. So I would say for me, meaning it's not about having a single thing. It's not just about your relationships. It can also be about creativity and expressing yourself, having autonomy as well. I think one of the problems when women put all of their kind of meaning into relationships, it can mean that they don't have a huge amount of autonomy over their lives, whether that's financial or physical. And so I think it's possible for us to have meaning from lots of different places. And I definitely feel like meaning for me comes from my relationships with my children, with my partner. It also comes from the creative work that I do and the friendships that I have and from so many different places. And I think it's okay to have meaning coming from lots of places.
So we've almost run out of time. That if you'd like to hear more, we're going to discuss a topic that I think is actually incredibly interesting, and I'd be very happy to hear Penny's thoughts on it, is how do you balance what you want to do and the pressures of life? Now, that's something that all of us have to actually do. We have to make a living, and we also have to do things that bring meaning into our lives. How you get that balance right is interesting, and I think it's something that Penny's aware of than most of us because the pressures of life are so great. So if you'd like to hear that question answered, you can hear the bonus material by subscribing directly via Apple or Spotify. And if you want to become a supporter of The Meaningful Life and unlock the bonus material this way, here are the details.
You've been listening to The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. You can follow Andrew on Twitter, like him on Facebook, and please leave a review wherever you consume your podcasts. Making, editing, and distributing The Meaningful Life comes with substantial costs, and we'd like to ask for your help. Visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material for every program, send in a letter to be discussed by Andrew and his guests, and join a community of other people seeking to make their life meaningful. At the gold level, you get even more benefits. Production of The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall is by Michael Dooney. Social media by Madeleine Healy. Sound engineering and theme tune by Sebastian de la Luz Mendoza. And I'm Susie Colick. Please tell your friends and spread the word. Thank you.
Everyone's talking about AI these days, right? This season on Compiler, we're diving deep into how AI is reshaping the world we live in. Join us for a new season of Compiler, an original podcast from Red Hat. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
It's true that some things change as we get older. But if you're a woman over 40 and you're dealing with insomnia, brain fog, moodiness, and weight gain, you don't have to accept it as just another part of aging. And with MIDI Health, you can get help and stop pushing through it alone. The experts at MIDI understand that all these symptoms can be connected to the hormonal changes that happen around menopause, and MIDI can help you feel more like yourself again. Many healthcare providers aren't trained to treat or even recognize menopause symptoms. MIDI clinicians are menopause experts. They're dedicated to providing safe, effective, FDA-approved solutions for dozens of hormonal symptoms, not just hot flashes. Most importantly, they're covered by insurance. 91% of MIDI patients get relief from symptoms within just 2 months. You deserve to feel great. Book your virtual visit today at joinmidi.com. That's joinmidi.com.